Tell us a bit about the Haisla Nation, where you're from. Tell us about the community.
So Haisla Nation, we have about 2,000 band members, continuously growing. We are at the head of the Douglas Channel in northern British Columbia.
A lot of Canadians might not know this, but your nation has been very involved in the biggest infrastructure project in Canada, which is LNG Canada. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
The project started out with Shell coming into our territory, introducing themselves. At the time, we had our chief counselor, Alice Ross, who started the beginning stages of what that relationship was going to look like.
Now, I've read things from Alice Ross. At first, he wasn't sure what he even thought about LNG. And I would imagine that was the case as well in the community. Like, what is this LNG thing?
When it came to any decisions that were being made around economic development, we had many proponents come to the nation at the time, bringing different commodities, potash, coal, LNG. And at that time, taking into consideration all the impacts, LNG had seemed to be the most environmentally acceptable commodity. So our council, being essentially led by Ellis, started doing their research. And when we weighed the pros and cons of all the proposals that were coming to our territory, it was the most accepted by our people.
What were you able to kind of put into the LNG Canada project to make it of value for your community?
What I'm seeing today is a very, very low unemployment rate. Whether our membership are accessing the employment opportunities on site or they're accessing higher education through the revenues that we've been able to generate to the community.
How did it set the stage for Cedar LNG?
So Cedar LNG is a majority-owned floating facility that's proposed for a territory that's majority-owned by the Haisla Nation in partnership with Pembina. Through our negotiations for our commercial agreements that we have with LNG Canada, our visionaries at the time were successful in negotiating 400 MMCF of capacity off the Coastal GasLink project that would essentially feed a facility that was owned by the nation. So when LNG Canada announced their positive final investment decision, Cedar became a reality to our nation to work towards.
What do you think makes Cedar a project that is very reflective of Haisla values?
We chose technologies that would have less impact on environmentally. We chose a floating facility that would have less impact on the land. Mm-hmm. We chose air-cooled versus water-cooled. And we wouldn't budge on the fact that we wanted this project to have less impact.
Korea, Japan are countries with climate change commitments, just like Canada. Why do they want to buy our gas?
Cedar LNG will be the cleanest LNG being produced here in BC and in Canada. And to help them hit their targets is by burning our LNG in the facilities that they have, whether it's for heating homes or powering the facilities that they have in their countries.
And I guess that's a good segue into the First Nations Climate Initiative. Can you tell me a bit about that?
The First Nations Climate Initiative is a collective of First Nations communities that felt that it was necessary for us to become a part of the climate solutions. As Indigenous, growing up with our culture, we were always taught to take care of our land, our territories, our trap lines. But when we think about it in a global context, it's becoming a part of solutions that are helping other countries essentially reduce their emissions that impact us globally.
Haisla has a project, but there are nations involved in other aspects of the supply chain leading there. Can you talk a little about that?
There are so many nations that we've been fortunate enough to build relationships through these projects that we're going through our own reconciliation process. And we've been able to form alliances that take care of all the social aspects that our people endure.
What do the rest of Canada need to know about what's going on here?
For the first time, our communities are becoming self-reliant. We're able to become a part of solutions, lifting our people out of poverty. Through these projects, we're investing in our culture, we're investing in our language, but most importantly, we're investing in our people of today and our future generations. And to be able to witness it today is absolutely tremendous.
So I'm Shannon Joseph. I'm the chair of Energy for a Secure Future, which is a new civil society initiative in Canada. We're really focused on adding important lenses to the energy conversation in Canada. I want to start off by thanking the Clean Resources Innovation Network for working with us to host this event. We're extremely grateful. I also want to acknowledge some of the international folks who have come here today, including representatives of the Director General of the Social Forestry and Environment Partnership of Indonesia. Hello, thank you for coming. We're really grateful to have international participation. I also would like to thank Takashi Hongo from Japan's Mitsui Institute, which is a think tank at Mitsui. We've come a long way, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to share what we've experienced with Canada with other countries, because we think there are important lessons to share. I'd like to invite up our panelists so we can get going with the conversation. And so I'll call up Karen Ogan, who is the CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance. Billy Morin, who is the managing partner at Excelis and former chief of the Enoch Cree Nation. Shanna Martineau, who's the CEO of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. And last but not least, Tim Shaw of Tourmaline, and Tourmaline is the largest natural gas producer in Canada. So we're very excited to have our panelists this morning. This session is called Indigenous-Industry Partnerships for a Low-Emission Future, and we think this is an important part of Canada's story and value proposition for the world, a world that needs energy security, even as it pursues emissions reduction. And I'd like to start off our conversation maybe by having Karen and then Billy tell us a little bit about what's going on in industry, Indigenous partnerships.
So the different projects that are in our midst in BC, we have the Cedar LNG project that's majority owned by the Haisla First Nation. And we also have the Silisms project that's with the Nisga'a Nation that's going to get their environmental assessment approval, so they're preparing for that. We also have the wood fiber project that's with the Squamish Nation. That particular project had their own environmental assessment designed specifically for their community. So those are the three projects that are in BC. We also have other projects with Fortis BC and the Musqueam First Nation. So those are the ones that I am aware of.
Wonderful, wonderful. And, to either of you, can you talk about why these partnerships are important? Where have First Nations in Canada been coming from in terms of being able to participate or not in the past? And, where are we trying to get to?
Yeah, when I first became chief in 2015, we were talking about impact benefit agreements, and I'm not taking anything away from impact benefit agreements and consultation. Those things are still foundational to development overall. But it was also just small service contracts. The exception to the rule was maybe Fort Mac with some of the nations around there, Fort Mackay First Nation doing big things. But outside of maybe Fort Mac, that area, no nation was getting equity ownership. And I won't steal Shauna's thunder too much, because that's the business that she's in. Well, actually, I'm in that business too. But, it went from, those small service contracts, those consultations, the one-off for the projects to actually talk about equity ownership. So again, like just short 9 years ago when I first became chief, it was those small things, but now it's $1.212 billion with 23 nations. And I know that bar is going to be continuously raised over the next little while. So, these things are important because, my personal philosophy as an Indigenous leader in Canada was, we can't be too dependent on government. That mindset has always been around. But now we're seeing with ownership, the leveraging of these projects and the ownership aspect, nations are building homes. One of my partners was mortgaging the first ever housing mortgages on reserve were a direct result of his ownership in certain projects. Another nation just built an arena from ownership in a project. Another nation just acquired more land in another project. So they're leveraging up with self-determination through ownership, not just doing the one-offs anymore. So that's why it's so important to Indigenous nations in Canada.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I think, that reality of economic exclusion for Indigenous people is true in many parts of the world. And I think the fact that things can turn around quickly when you get economic access is so important. Shanna, you're leading one of the most exciting programs I think that exists in Canada. Can you tell our audience about that program and how it fits into this ecosystem?
Sure, I would love to do that. So the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation is a loan guarantee program for Indigenous communities to buy into large-scale infrastructure projects in our country. And so, and I don't know how this translates around the world, but in Canada, Indigenous peoples were precluded from participating in the economy. Come on in and sit down, you guys. We're a friendly group. They were precluded by the Indian Act in Canada from legally holding collateral, taking loans, and then therefore were excluded from the economy. And so our Truth and Reconciliation community called on corporate Canada to include economic reconciliation. And so this was an act by the Alberta government to provide financing alternatives for First Nations communities. It's very important that this is a community-led initiative, so that a great quote by Heather Exner-Perot said, without economic self-determination, there is no political self-determination. And so it is really enabling everything that these communities need to do. And so we are there to help bring the corporate partners together and then provide a loan guarantee through partners like ATB Financial, who's in the room with us today, to access capital. And those projects are returning real dollars to communities right now. So we are forecasting that in 2024, communities in our province, which is roughly 5 million people in total, Albertans in total, there will be north of $30 million a year next year going into just Indigenous communities that wasn't there 5 years ago. So something that we're very, very proud of. We're just at the beginning. By the end of next week, we will have close to $700 million deployed in loan guarantees.
That's fantastic. And, maybe Tim, you can jump in. You're kind of representing the company side of this. Can you talk from Tourmaline's perspective about how these partnerships have evolved for your company? What are some of the important lessons and benefits and value? Yeah, tell us about Tourmaline's experience with this.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for including us in this conversation. I'm happy and excited to be part of it here at the CRIN Pavilion at COP. We are not quite at the AIOC level of partnerships with communities yet. But I will talk a little bit about our approach for, in partnering with Indigenous communities. And so our first step really is approaching it as relationship building. Like before we even get to talking about what does the nation or the community want from an economic or social perspective, let's build a relationship. So step one is going in and being part of the community and better understanding their needs. And then from there, getting into some of the discussions about, okay, what's next? And so for us, we take a very community specific approach to evolving those ideas and those concepts. And it's had some pretty interesting results. Like, for example, right now in British Columbia, restoration is a hot topic, and there's a ton of work that's being done around that and how cumulative effects are addressed. So there are nations that are looking to establish companies where restoration companies where they'll go in, they'll restore the land, they'll replant, bring it back up to the condition it was before any industrial impact. And what Tourmaline is doing is supporting some of those companies sort of with seed or startup funding so that they can then establish a business that will provide jobs to the community, the economic contributions, and employ members for hopefully a long time, that will also provide a great service to the area that we operate in.
All right. And, I think what's been important and, is my career working in the energy space, which is about 5 years long. People think that the relationship is like before the project and then the project gets approved and the relationship's over. But in Canada, and I think there are other companies who can speak to this, the relationship is forever. It's the whole length of the project. It's anytime you want to do an expansion, and that too is an important part. A relationship is a relationship. And that's, I think, an important lesson coming out of Canada. Before we pass on to the environmental piece, because I think this is a really, we're at the COP conference, I just want to maybe ask one last question to Karen or Billy about, from your end, what has been important in successful partnerships and navigating these partnerships from the Indigenous side and even from the community management side? Karen, you're from a nation, the Wet'suwet'en, where there's been tensions. And so how does all that get navigated so that we can have a win-win?
I think I'm the former chief of my nation, and when these agreements were being signed, I was the chief at the time that signed our project agreement with Coastal GasLink. There are 6 Wet'suwet'en nations in the Burns Lake Smithers area, and it was a tough time at that time because not a lot of our nations had any experience with any type of resource development. So that was why we formed the First Nations LNG Alliance, so that we could inform people about what LNG is and what it isn't, and to advocate. Because for the first time, like Shanna said, we have not been involved with projects. And so this was our first kick at the can in being able to get involved in a project where there was procurement opportunities, Indigenous businesses were being helped, and it brought more prosperity to our community. Now we can see that the benefits and the fruit of these projects are, for our community, has been more housing. We've been able to get clean drinking water, which a lot of people take for granted. So those were 2 of the main benefits that we got out of these projects. We also have a equity stake of 10% or 7.5% in the Coastal GasLink line, which our community has never had that opportunity before. So this is our first time being able to participate in the economy, to boost our economy. And I think those are really beneficial pieces for our community. And I think the biggest piece and takeaway, especially for this conference, is that it's the cleanest LNG. I just come back from Beijing, and they're still wanting our LNG. The coal burning is very high. I went there in 2015, it was still the same. So there's still a demand around the world for our LNG. And I think with Canada being at the helm, Indigenous people being involved, I think that's, a win-win across the board. So I think that's where we need to be with Canada, is being able to export our LNG so that we can help the global emissions, whether it be in Asia or Europe or wherever. I think that's where we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Billy, did you want to add anything?
I just wanted
Or
to say,
anybody?
by doing that, Karen, we also help the Indigenous people all along that chain, right? So we're not just helping the world transition to a lower emission environment, but we're helping Indigenous people be successful at the same time. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's free flowing conversation. What I'll add, and I know Shannon's going to pivot towards emissions reduction, and that's where I'll just highlight my comments of the management of the Indigenous partnership. So, a big part of the Alberta delegation here is about carbon capture utilization. Probably the most exciting thing that I'm involved with when it comes to green space development for energy projects or subsequent projects that are involved with energy, maybe not necessarily on the production, but on the carbon reduction piece. And for our nation, and obviously all nations for the most part across Canada, they're community owns. I guess you can kind of compare them in Canada to a Crown Corp, but that's not a fair comparison. So, when you're talking about the management of the relationship, and you mentioned it, Shannon, it's forever. And, when we talk about carbon capture utilization with my members at the nation, and along with the new chief Cody, it's not about the money-making piece. It's about the impact piece. So, and it's about treaty rights and about historical perspectives on what are you guys pumping in the ground? Have you ever done this before? Is the water going to be clean? The business stuff is great. That's a side, but it's our elders who want to demand that piece of, well, what's it look like 10 years from now, 7-generation thinking mindset from now. So, it's not just, the typical shareholder that, looks about rate of return and share price. It's what are you doing for the environment? And every single day, And any Indigenous nation, whether it's Kainai of 10,000 people or Enoch of 2,800 approximately, they're going to demand that we look not just at the bottom line, but at the holistic approach of developing carbon capture utilization.
I'm really glad you've gone there, Billy, because we certainly want to, because there's certainly a conversation in Canada about are Indigenous people only interested in the economic side of this? How are they advancing the environmental characteristics of these projects to ensure that they do carry the value? Before kind of we go back in that direction, I want to give Tim a chance to talk about what industry is doing to lower emissions, because there's a conversation, and Karen just mentioned it, that Canada has low emission gas and is continuing to lower the emissions profile of that gas as a solution for global emissions. So talk to us a bit about what Tourmaline has been doing and other gas players in Canada.
For sure. So I think, first of all, I want to mention that Canada just has an environmental advantage from the very starting point for our natural gas, and especially through the Montney and into British Columbia, just producing that gas can be done at lower emissions than just about anywhere else in the world. It's very efficient. So from our starting point, we're quite advantaged. And then when it comes to addressing emissions across our operations, companies are doing a number of different things. We've spent a bunch of time here at COP and at the CRIN pavilion talking about some of the methane leadership that we've been doing, and so Tourmaline with Perpetual Energy through the NGIF Innovation Fund, it supports and hosts an emissions testing center at one of our facilities in Alberta, and this gives technology companies an opportunity to do live field tests of their technology and see how they perform around methane monitoring, measurement, and mitigation. So we're investing in new technologies that are, probably not what you would expect, your typical person would expect the oil and gas industry to kind of be exploring, giving them a living laboratory to do that. And then we have the opportunity as well to deploy those across our operations and see some results. So that's sort of one example. And then there's kind of the more boring stuff that's more nuts and bolts engineering type activities using heat waste recovery and other kind of more applications that just improve the efficiency of operations.
And I want to ask a hot pursuit question, just because our minister announced earlier this week a methane new target. Can you speak a little bit about where Canada is starting on some of these things versus the United States or some of our other competitors around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've been subject to methane regulations for decades and really been active on it. And so we as a nation, as Canada, have really been a leader on how do we measure better, how do we stop leaks, how do we mitigate those emissions. And now other countries like the US are playing catch up. So when it comes to looking at where do we want this gas to come from for LNG, that's got to be a consideration that Canada really is a step ahead when it comes to addressing all of these issues, and that, as well as our kind of natural environmental advantage, is going to put us even further ahead. And maybe I'll give a bit of scale to how this actually applies. So at Tourmaline, we've done a life cycle analysis at one of our facilities in British Columbia, and it's compared the life cycle emissions of the gas that we process there to other producing jurisdictions across North America. And what it's found is if you take that gas and you use it to produce electricity, it results in about 25% or a third of the emissions of gas from other jurisdictions. So wow. It's significantly lower and more efficient.
All right. So then, on top of what's happening on the company side, First Nations in Canada and Indigenous people in Canada are also launching their own kind of projects in this space, like the First Nations Climate Initiative and other initiatives. Did you want to jump in before I ask them about that? Okay. So Karen, can you tell us a little bit about the First Nations Climate Initiative in Canada? What are you trying to do? You just had a paper come out. Tell us about that.
Well, I think Dr. Robert Johnston just did a research paper for FNCI, and I think the gist of it was that they were looking at how these emissions are, and also how it's supposed to assist Canada. I haven't fully read the report, on Dr. Robert Johnson's, but I know it was to assist us with like Cedar LNG and Sialisms on, you know, Canada having the lowest emissions and the cleanest LNG, and that document supported that.
And Shanna, you know, nations like Halfway River are doing nature-based solutions for emissions mitigation. We heard about that at the Canadian Pavilion. Others like the Blood Tribe, I know, are pursuing solar and wind projects alongside their conventional energy. What are some of the projects you're seeing coming through the door that also continue to advance our emissions goals?
So one of the things I'll mention is that I can't talk too specifically about projects that we're seeing due to confidentiality restrictions. So we're often under NDA. I think like many parts of the world, Alberta transitioned off of coal very quickly, very rapidly. And so the first opportunity to provide loan guarantees was in the natural gas space. So, and that is a move to the cleaner economy. Now we are looking at all kinds of renewables and other areas. I know that carbon capture is of a big interest. And so for our organization, we support where we can. There are other parts of the Alberta government that support the commercialization of some of those technologies. And then we would be able to support through a loan guarantee. But organizations like Emissions Reduction in Alberta, who's made some big announcements here today, as well as Alberta Innovates, they work with those early stage companies. I know we were doing some brainstorming in the back here about how can we support some of the Indigenous innovation as well. But what we're doing right now is a bit more on the mature stage side. So I will turn it over to some of my colleagues.
Well, I'll highlight Shannon's program as a launching point too. So, you know, her LNG example is Enoch and a few other nations. That takes 10,000 cars off the road. It replaced coal, obviously, in a really, really fast fashion. But AIOC, that's the Cascade Power Facility, which is about to first fire pretty soon, if not a week ago, I think. But that aside, it's a launching point. So it gives legitimacy to the nations. So, you know, you translate that into existing assets, you know, what the market has been in Alberta for a long time, oil and gas, and that's great. But it gives us, again, that legitimacy to talk to people like Dow Chemicals. So it's not impossible for nations now to say that we can legitimize ourselves in the oil and gas and walk into Dow and say Dow is building a $12 billion investment in terms of the net zero plastics facility in the capital region, and say, wow, nations can do it over there. Maybe they can do it over here in this facility. Then the next one's hydrogen, Air Products. Air Product is now talking to the nations about maybe there's equity ownership there. And then so it subsequently, again, it legitimizes nations to go in these clean energy spaces and partner and kind of be that facilitator between even maybe the industry competitors of partnering with the nations and kind of the grassroots Albertans and giving them that ESG lift up and that kind of that special story or that value added in terms of the Alberta market itself.
I think that's a great point around ESG. Shanna or Tim, there's been a lot of conversation in the Canadian kind of financial space about putting the I in ESG. Can you talk about how that's been evolving?
I think it has been discussed, but I don't know how much actual traction that has had. And it's one of the goals, I think, that there are many, many large corporations that are doing great work with Indigenous partnerships, at least in Western Canada. Alberta specifically is the market I know best. And I do think that needs to be recognized. When I've talked to sustainability capital providers, they've asked us, like, how can we incorporate these Indigenous partnerships into ESG frameworks? And we don't have a way to measure that right now. And I do think that that's an important step that we need to take. And so it's something that is high on my radar to start some advocacy work. And there's a couple of people in our audience that I'm going to tap for help on that. We need to move the agenda forward. And I think Canada is in a unique position to be able to help carry that to the international stage.
Wonderful. Tim?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I'm not aware of how it is or isn't progressing with specific frameworks and whatnot, but I know that, you know, for Tourmaline, we do report on our sort of engagement with Indigenous people and the communities and some of the work that we do with them in our sustainability report. So there is a level of accountability and a bit more transparency that's coming up these days. And I think that that's a really positive step as well.
And, you know, I think what I've heard certainly from CEOs in Canada is that they have, you know, they might go to New York or Houston to talk to investors, might have a perception that Indigenous relations in Canada have created an investment risk. And I think part of this work has been about evolving people's understanding. I wonder if any of you can comment on that perception from investors or the international community about Canada, and how they should start to understand the way things are evolving.
I might start if that's okay. Shannon, I think that this is happening very rapidly. So I think what we're hearing from other government entities and other crown corporations is that as they travel the world and other businesses, that the Alberta story is starting to catch global attention too. And so we've had tons of reach out from other nations about how are we doing what we're doing. International companies are looking at investing in our province because of the progressive nature with Indigenous relations. And so I sat at a energy roundtable in Calgary during World Petroleum Congress and talked about how even as soon as a few years ago, it seemed impossible to do large-scale infrastructure projects because of poor Indigenous relations. And now that's becoming a strength. So with these equity partnerships, and like Cedar LNG and others, that is all of a sudden Canada's becoming a model of how you can achieve these kinds of outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the biggest things that the panel also talked about was that whole environmental piece, which is, from the Indigenous perspective, we do see ourselves as the stewards of the land. And so that's really important, especially at this conference. We expect the highest environmental standards coupled with the economy piece. And I think that, it's been a long time coming for Indigenous people in Canada. Instead of being left on the sidelines, we're now a part of, this is economic reconciliation. We are in the era of reconciliation. And so that's what these major projects mean in Canada. When you can look at First Nations, the equity ownership piece, the environmental piece, and all of the different pieces that investors are looking for, those are important. And that's how we make for a successful project. And just to allude to what Shannon had spoken to earlier, the relationship building is from beginning to beyond the project. That's important. I think a lot of people might just check boxes. Okay, we've met with the nations, that's done, and move on. I think it's important. Relationship building is very important to Indigenous communities. And I continue to emphasize that in all of the presentations that I do.
Yeah, on our first AIOC deal, ATB was our backer financially, and we thank ATB for that. It's a provincial organization to the province of Alberta, and Shanna deals with that subnational organization kind of mindset, but she also can go cross borders inside the borders of Canada. So, we've got accounts with ATB and projects with ATB and other local Canadian national banks. But, kind of the major cool thing was we weren't just talking to them. We were talking about pension funds like Axiom out of Montreal. Then we were sitting in the same room as the Dutch Infrastructure Fund and Siemens, who were major investors on Cascade. So, the world's becoming progressively smaller. And again, these kind of projects put us at the tables of international investors. We're here in COP today, and there's large institutional investors walking around here. And again, it's not intimidating for us to get in those spaces and attract investment to Canadian infrastructure. For our members, we're small. We consider the whole territory of Alberta shared territory with other 45 First Nations, roughly 45, 46, 44, whatever you want to the number is. But that aside, again, is our my nation's only 4 by 5 miles, but we do share that larger territory. So the mindset's a little bit different, right? This is new for them to talk about globalization and attracting Dutch infrastructure investment into the nation. But it's a great thing. It's because, again, it's not just going to be Enoch as a small 2,800 person within a $4 or $5 million population of Alberta. It's going to take global partnerships on that unprecedented level to attack climate change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on one thing because it's such a live issue in Canada. There's been a lot of discussion about the federal government introducing a program similar to AIOC. And I know, Karen, you've had to comment a lot in media about this. What is this program going to look like? Why is it important? Why is it important to be flexible? What do you think are the potential benefits of having this enhancement to the environment in terms of having a federal loan guarantee program for First Nations and Indigenous people more broadly?
Well, I think that for most of the communities, especially where I'm from, not a lot of nations have that access to capital. And a lot of nations, if you were to put us on a continuum from 0 to 100, there are nations that have little to no capacity within community. And then you have the larger communities that have a lot of capacity. So we're dealing with 600 First Nations in Canada. Those are the Indian Act Band Councils. And then you have about 204 in BC. So there's a lot of nations that there's quite a diversity in Canada. And I think that this whole piece about the loan guarantee, I think Shanna probably has more of a insight on that, but I think that piece, it needs to be more accessible to First Nations that don't have that access to capital. And I think that's an important piece that we need to continue to assist communities with that piece and find ways and means to get them to the table, to get access to capital so that they can participate in the equity ownership.
I'll just build on a little bit of what Karen was saying. So, Karen went to China and she was saying that in 2015, they were producing coal and they're still increasing coal. I think those are the headlines we all know about. And, when it comes to loan guarantees, there's a little bit of controversy in the Canadian loan program right now to not include oil and gas. It's still yet to be determined. But, Canada at the end of the day is what, 1.5, 2% of global emissions or something low like that. And, we've done it. We've done it in Alberta where liquid natural gas has displaced coal. We're now attaching carbon capture utilization to natural gas facilities that produce power and even lowering our emissions more so that way. And so Canada, it's not a question of stranded assets, what I've heard some politicians say. It's if we really want to be contributors, we got to go outside our borders, and we cannot strand our assets in provinces that are landlocked. So, there's no economic reconciliation or moving large projects in Canada without Indigenous participation. So we have to be a little bit more strategic in that if we're going to do loan guarantees across all provincial borders nationally, we got to include these mega projects with displaced coal and other international markets. So I hope that Canada is a little bit more strategic in that regard when it comes to loan guarantee programs for First Nations. I mean, it works in Alberta. Again, we just displaced 10,000 cars through a liquid natural gas plant that is already contemplating CCUS. I mean, if we're going to get our products to market and displace coal in China or in Eastern Asia or Asia, again, Canada has to be a little more strategic about not stranding our assets here in the country.
Not surprisingly, I couldn't agree more with both of you. I know that's a big shock to everybody. What I would say as well that, Indigenous people are stewards of the land, and we have been since time immemorial. And so that you have to trust Indigenous people to make good decisions, and you have to, and they will make good decisions. And that's what we've seen in our partnerships already to date. And what we've seen is the rapid acceleration, the change that has happened even in the short time frame that AIOC was created to now is mind-boggling. I think, Billy, when you did your first deal, I know when I came onto the board, I couldn't have fathomed that where we would be today versus even just 2 short years ago or 3 short years ago. And so it's rapidly changing. And what I'm maybe most proud of is the change in the conversation and the dynamics that Indigenous people feel empowered. So I do want to share a story of a Métis settlement in northwestern Alberta, very hard hit by wildfires. And they are working on a transaction with us right now that will start generating them revenue very quickly in the next 60 days or 90 days. And so and another another corporate entity came to the community and started talking to them about consultation about the project that they wanted to build on their lands. And this counselor looked at them and said, "Why are you talking to me about consultation? Why are you not here offering me equity share?" And so the empowerment from just one opportunity gave them the vision and the strength and the courage to have the conversation in a very different way. And so that, I think, is what is so tremendously powerful. And so I think the federal government can't even conceive what they can unleash and unlock with this program. And so I really encourage them to get fully behind the Indigenous reconciliation part of it and not be prescriptive about where Indigenous communities choose to invest.
And I think, what I've certainly heard in conversation with other nations is just how important it is for people and decision makers to keep in mind that different parts of Canada have different economic opportunities. And if the government is serious about reconciliation, it needs to create something that is flexible enough for the fact that the opportunities that exist for a nation near Toronto are not the same as the ones that are in the Northwest Territories. And they need to be able to pursue the options and the opportunities that are there. And, the other point I think I would make, and Shanna, you might be able to speak to this a bit more, is that the importance too of some of these loan guarantees from the federal level is that it decreases the cost of borrowing. And so it increases the revenue that would go back to the community sooner. And this is important too, for all the reasons we've heard from Carrie and Billy of where these nations are trying to get to. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. So in our region, that the communities borrow at a little bit north of what the provincial cost of capital is, the government of Alberta. We're fortunate that Alberta has a very strong balance sheet, which is one of the reasons that we've been enabled to deliver this program. The federal level, that's about a percentage point difference between the federal cost of capital and the provincial cost of capital. And so when you think about 1% on a, let's call it a $500 million project a year, the amount of revenue that is transformative. And then it's not like that goes and sits in the bank account. That is reinvested into the community, into other business projects. It's a capital accelerator. So I talk about these programs. It's Indigenous economic reconciliation, and it's your economic development strategy, and it's your job strategy, and it's all of these pieces. And so it's a capital accelerator right through the entire fabric of the economy. And so we're a much stronger economy in Alberta with the Indigenous communities having the investable assets that they have.
I want to pivot to something Karen had started talking about in her trip to China, and maybe give Tim a chance to weigh in. One of the important messages that Energy for a Secure Future is bringing to this COP, and why we wanted to have this conversation as well, is that global emissions piece. The whole design of the Paris Agreement makes countries really focus on their national targets, which, yes, let's work on that. But there's this global big picture, and Billy talked about that as well. Tim, when Tourmaline goes out to international customers who are looking at energy solutions and emission solutions, what are you guys hearing?
Well, I think the thing we hear most loud and clear is that people want our gas. So we get calls, and our marketing team has conversations all the time with customers from all over the world that are looking for Canada's responsibly produced natural gas. I think one of the biggest pieces of evidence that demonstrate the impact that this can have from our perspective is Tourmaline earlier this year in January started to actually ship gas down to the U.S. Gulf Coast, where it is. We've got an arrangement with Cheniere where they and ship out LNG. So if this gas, it's enough for about one LNG shipment a month. And if it was all used to displace coal-fired power in China, it would result in emission reductions of over 2 megatons a year. And so, the ability to do that is definitely wanted around the world.
Wow. We and Karen and Billy have both been part of this, have started to engage in our own international relations. And you guys have really brought messages to ambassadors from the United States, from Japan, from other countries, a message about how the solutions in First Peoples in Canada want to bring to the world. Can you speak about your experience talking to those international folks and what you heard from them about what they want and their interest in working with you?
Yeah, they want our natural gas. They want our hydrogen. They want our nuclear technology as Cameco in Saskatchewan. They want Canadian products. And again, I'll just highlight that, nothing big in scale in economic reconciliation Canada gets built without Indigenous nations going across provincial boundaries nowadays. And so, I was talking to a bunch of pension funds nationally and internationally in Vancouver one day, and they were saying, how much, I was really actually surprised, really quick, was a story is, I asked them, how many of you have been in an actual nation? And for these large international investors, over half of them were like, yeah, we invest in Canada. We've actually been to a First Nation. So you don't have to convince us that economic reconciliation is a part of doing business in Canada, but we still kind of don't know all the details of it. And then what they also said was like the regulatory regime is just a little bit too stringent. 5% of our international capital infrastructure funds are going into other markets, not this market. And so, you know, they want Canadian products. I mean, Canada is the second largest landmass in the world, but we're still not being efficient in finding that balance between development and carbon reduction and in terms of moving projects forward and just getting it done. But again, we've proven it time and time again. I just wish that we can be a little bit more efficient in getting things done. You know, in the Edmonton Capital Region, again, you know, we had Dow Chemicals just invest $12 billion, provincial and federal governments coming together. And then finally, again, that opened up the doors for Indigenous, still early days, but Indigenous equity ownership in that piece. But I won't, there's no commitment to that yet, but I know they're talking. And so again, if that can be done, we got to think a little bit bigger in terms of getting those things across international and interprovincial borders.
Karen, did you want to add anything?
I think there was an article that was released out of the Canada Energy Center, which I thought was pretty on point with what we're talking about now. So they had this global picture of the highest emitting countries in the world. China was at 30%, the US was at 15%, and India was third. This, for me, makes complete sense that Canada sells our LNG to China to help them offset their coal, to bring their GHG emissions down. It makes perfect sense from my perspective as an Indigenous person, because it's cheaper. It takes less days to get from you know, Vancouver or Haisla to China instead of going through the Panama Canal from the US. So I think in that regard, the timing of getting our goods to Asia and it just, you know, it'll help with our economy, not only for Canada, for BC, for Indigenous people. And it's just in line. It's time. I can't emphasize that enough. It's everything's lined up there. We just got to have Canada move on that. And that's really what I advocate for. And then just coming back from Beijing, like almost 8 years later, they are still wanting our LNG. How much more do we need to stay? Yeah, it makes sense. Like, let's just do this. We want to lower emissions. Well, that's how we do it. And we need to have, you know, the federal and provincial governments on board. I can't emphasize that message enough.
All right. Well, I want to give chance for our audience to ask questions because the room is really filled up and it's very exciting. But before I turn it over to the audience, I just wanted to give each of you an opportunity to say, you know, if you could talk to the negotiators in those, you know, secret rooms that are somewhere on this property about what's important as they continue to work towards, you know, the next steps from this very large gathering, what would you leave them with? And maybe I'll start with Tim, and then we can just go down the line.
You know, I would say it's important work. That they are absolutely like reducing emissions is important, but the energy stack is growing, and so energy sources of all types are going to be needed. So we've talked a bit today about how efficient Canada's natural gas is, and the role our LNG can play in addressing global emissions. That's got to be considered, right? Like, let's look at where we are today and start taking those steps forward, and we've got a role to play there.
Wonderful. Shanna?
Thank you. I would just add, I think all of Tim's comments, and it is very important work, and reducing emissions is very, very important. But energy security and energy poverty is also a very important issue. And so I think we need to look at all of those things in aggregate and come at them as a collective solution with collective inputs to the finding those solutions.
You know, we're at COP. I've seen Indigenous perspectives highlighted as a aspirational theme of COP this year in Dubai. And, you know, like if you're from Canada, if you're from any country, any space in the world, you're Indigenous to somewhere. So Indigenous people play a part in every single country on this globe. And what I would say is that, in Canada, we don't have it perfect. There's always room for improvement, but I would say, particularly in Western Canada, the snowball has grown from just the palm of my hand maybe 10 short years ago to something that it's going to take, it's taking 45 or 23 or cross-border nations with LNG and multiple other projects, like I mentioned, Camco, every single industry, critical mining aspects, nuclear. We're doing it right over there. Engagement, again, not perfect, still got a ways to go, but I think if you're going to look for a model in terms of Indigenous engagement in your own home country, maybe come to Canada and see how we're doing it there. I think we have something special to share with the world.
All right.
Just to end my piece, we had the LNG 2023 in July in Vancouver, and part of our slogan there was Canadian LNG is Indigenous LNG. And that should sum up what we want to talk about in terms of reconciliation, equity ownership, and all of those pieces, what it means to Indigenous people of Canada, but also to the world. Misai.
All right. Well, with that, I'll open it up to questions from the audience. Would anyone? Yes.
Okay, I have a couple questions and I came in a little bit late, so I apologize. But first, I want to know a little bit more about the equity ownership projects and whether there are any sort of environmental stipulations or could be negotiations in the contract around how the projects are managed that might be more stringent than the regulatory environment. So I don't know who would be the most appropriate person to ask. Secondly, if I can squeeze two in, what would your advice be to First Nations that are being approached now by companies for projects like CCUS or CCS projects, and they don't necessarily have the expertise to understand what questions they need to be asking and where to start? And a lot of, I've talked with some that are, feeling skeptical, not quite sure, especially in the United States, where historically that engagement has been more of like a checkbox, but the rights have been ignored and things like that. Just wondering what advice you would give actually to the First Nations versus like the companies that are engaging with them.
So Karen wants to start. Okay.
I can answer part of your second question, and this was my experience while I was the chief for our nation. Our nation was one of the nations that had little to no capacity. We hired a lead negotiator to help us, assist us with every step of the way. One example was we wanted to make sure, like our elders spoke to us, they don't want any of their berry patches to be touched. They don't want any of their fishing sites to be touched. So we got the, our instructions from our elders. And so we had to hire somebody with those expertise to ensure that those areas weren't touched. And I think that we asked the company, well, you want something from us? Well, we need somebody to help us with our environmental lead. Give us the money to do the work that needs to be done. Give us the capacity to do this work so that we're doing it right. So that was one of the ways that I think working with First Nations that have little to no capacity.
Mm-hmm.
I'll highlight actually a little bit of Karen's where she lives. I've heard that wood fiber has developed their own kind of regulatory regime, and that's in BC for LNG development, port development, exporting development, and that's pretty unprecedented actually. And I think it's still under development. Treaty 8 in northern BC as well, with Blueberry First Nation, has also embedded themselves into the provincial regulatory regime. So, I look again to those kind of first movers in terms of when you were talking about engagement and lack of capacity, or highlighting their kind of traditional mindset in a modern context of development. Those nations in BC have gone above and beyond, I would say, in developing a kind of parallel regulatory regime with the provincial government and subsequently federal governments, and if it's a federal legislated project. So I would kind of maybe do a little bit more research on that. They're leading the way. And then again, on the capacity side for development, my nation too, like I said, when I go to my elders and I talk to them about CCUS, again, it's not about the dollar amount, Billy. We really like the idea of lowering global emissions. Pragmatically, we're seen as stewards of the land. We could see ourselves doing that. But, I don't have a PhD scientist from my nation that's an expert on geological technology. And so we do rely upon the experts. We have a great actual partnership with the local institutions. So I would encourage nations to partner not just in industry, but on the post-secondary educational aspects too as well, because they're wanting to partner with Indigenous nations that way. So leverage those partnerships, not just in industry, but in the public sector and the education sector as well.
Mhm.
I would say just from our perspective, we provide capacity grant funding for some of these pieces. So it would be, they're typically, that capacity grant funding is related to projects that we are going to provide loan guarantees for, but it's not always that way. So we will provide supports for that. And then there are key learnings for those individuals. Same thing, I'll go back to that Métis settlement, key learnings that the communities get along the way from participating in those early projects that really help. So I think all of those pieces, I would venture to say that any true Indigenous partnership, I would be shocked if they didn't exceed regulatory standards every single time. And what I often talk to corporate executives, I spent 30 years in finance. I'm a First Nations person, but I spent my life in the corporate world before doing this job. Is that your leaders will be better leaders for the Indigenous partnerships, for the day-to-day, side by side, partnering together. Your companies are better for those, and you will just, it will just naturally go to their beyond the minimum thresholds.
Mhm. Did you want to say something, Tim? Okay, sir, you had a question?
Thank you. I'm Prasetyo from Indonesia. I'm a deputy director in customary forest, the one and only unit in Indonesia to serve and protect indigenous people in Indonesia. I want to know about, and I'm indigenous people too. I'm First Nation in Yogyakarta Kingdom, but now it's in Indonesia. Thank you. I'm First Nation too. My question is about the beneficiaries to all the community. When the partnership is begun, how to ensure all the beneficiaries to came in the right hand to all the communities? Because I'm First Nation in Yogyakarta, but if some partnership like that, maybe I can have beneficiaries of this partnership, because our community is very, very big.
Okay.
How many household and community in your tribe or your community, or your Indigenous people? Because sometimes in Indonesia, now we have recognized 131 communities to have own land and forest.
Okay.
And how the partnership in the land of your on your community is owned by indigenous people or owned by state, the land or the forest? Because in our country, we recognize to become own of indigenous people, the land and the forest. Is first question. And two, how to ensure the beneficiaries to become all the household in your community. Thank you.
Okay. So I think for the first part of that, did someone want to jump in? Because I had a little something, but I'm going to let Billy go.
Well, if you ask a First Nations person from Alberta, how much do they own? They're going to say they own all the treaty territory. They share it. Now, if you ask a provincial government person, they're going to say we own the province, like maybe not own. So it's kind of a balance. All of Canada, in particular, Western Canada's traditional Indigenous territory. Its ownership and sovereignty are important, but the treaties in Canada, we see them as like guaranteeing our sovereignty. They're on paper, but also what I would say is that they're about sharing. So it's not just about ownership. It's about you and me working together, non-Indigenous Canadians and Canadians working together. It does give us certain Indigenous constitutional rights, but at their core, it's about doing right by each other. So, all the forests, all the prairies, we would say we collectively own them, along with the other 45 First Nations. So we're responsible for them along with Canadians. For the second part of your question, about the impacts going back to individuals in our nations or the communities ourselves. Again, like, so we're governed typically in Canada by chief and councils, democratically elected positions. And so, you know, what I would say about industry and things of this nature is their business decisions. And I think business is a universal language. It's not it's a universal language that you can do in Indonesia, you can do in China, you can do in Africa, and you can do in Canada. And so it's up to the nations with their dividends and their business success, not the government of Canada dictating how they spend money, not the provincial government, not even their partners. It's a business decision that they can invest in their community how they see fit. So it's true self-determination in Canada that we're leveraging to better ourselves. And again, what I would highlight on the grassroots level is that I've seen this ownership piece go into a piece where we've heard today that nations were so dependent on building their own houses from government. I mean, government would build us 10 houses, but we have 3,000 people. That doesn't make sense. And legally, we could not build our own houses on our own lands through the Canadian government system, but that's a different rabbit hole. But I would say that with business ownership, the first ever mortgage housing and bank loans going on Indigenous housing are happening from our ownership. So you see it making a real transition. And one more I would highlight is that I've seen nations also do food sovereignty. So they're investing back into food sovereignty through their success in business as well.
Mm. Do you want to add it?
Just to add that a lot of the First Nations communities really were good at managing poverty. And I think now it's a new day to have to learn how to manage prosperity. So our nation is looking at policies in place to ensure that our members are beneficiaries, that the money trickles down to the community members. Examples are for our community, we give bonuses at Christmas. We make sure that, you know, we're trying to increase the housing for our community so that we make sure that our community members are being served by every agreement that comes across the board.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I'd want to add, and you know, I heard this talking to Billy yesterday, is that, you know, there are projects where the benefits flow to communities within a certain radius of the infrastructure or the certain radius of the project. And that's why it's so important just to have many projects and for Canada to pursue various opportunities in various sectors to make these things happen. And that's why Shanna's program is so important. And if there's a federal program, that will be so important because it just enables more to happen and for Indigenous people to benefit, for wider Canadian society to benefit. And I think through that, everybody wins. Are there any other questions, sir?
I didn't know my father was here, sir. Nobody calls me sir. My name is Mustafa Sahin. I'm with Edmonton Global. There are a few questions I could ask. One is just a comment to what Karen said earlier about exporting LNG to Asia to really help with carbon reduction. I think given the increasing importance of the Indigenous voice in Canada, anything you can do coming back from COP to continue to advocate to the other parts of Canada who don't believe in exporting LNG, how important it is for other parts of the world, I think is increasingly important. The question I would have, and you know, Chief Billy, I know you had your experience here previously, as we continue to see projects collaboratively in partnership with Indigenous and First Nation Canada, and the money starts to flow, and you look at developing the nations and the skill sets and the gaps and the infrastructure, are there any things you can take away from the successes that the UAE's had, which is in some ways kind of a first cousin of Indigenous people and what they've done with their wealth transformation and the, you know, uplifting of the skills of the Indigenous population?
Yeah, well, I've been to the UAE before. I'm generally curious on what you guys are learning from it. I hope you guys, what would you take back to nations and Canada back there, what you've seen here? I'll go after you.
This is just a newbie answer to this community because I'm not as familiar, but what I would say is that I'm astounded and impressed with this city. I will go to Abu Dhabi tomorrow, and this is an example of, I think, what can be achieved when Indigenous people have full participation and control their own economy and resources. That's what I would say, Billy, but you have more experience than me at this.
I'll give an example. So I have been to UAE before once, and UAE always reminded me of actually a First Nation. Not that I'm going to build skyscrapers tomorrow in First Nations in Canada, but you look at UAE, traditional oil and gas market dominated GDP. That's lowering. That's actually what it is like in Western Canada for us. Traditional oil and gas going down. We're doing other things. UAE, you can count as a large family business at the end of the day. Maybe most First Nations are actually large family businesses. And then certain tax implications. I mean, UAE is a tax-free logistical zone that moves a lot of things. Nations are at key different points, whether they're developing a large industry project in the rural sector or in next to a large municipality. We have certain tax advantages and sovereign advantages to develop our own governance system within our small nations to make sure they're like special economic zones like the UAE. So there is something to be learned here for Indigenous nations to take back to theirs. They've implemented it. I always compliment this country on how they're 20, 30 years ahead in terms of their mindset of just getting it done. And the one I would highlight is when I did come here, I went to Abu Dhabi and got to see the Cleveland Clinic and the things that they're doing and they're partnering with. And I was so inspired to take that back to my nation. And so, again, partnering with the Alberta government is just doing such great things within Indigenous nations in the province of Alberta. That subsequently turned into the first announcement, and it's under construction right now, of the first sovereign orthopedic surgical center on an Indigenous nation in Canada from my visit at UAE. So it's thinking outside the box and bringing those things back here internationally to our nations. So the nations are giving back to us as well.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, well, as some of you would have seen in our advertising of this event, we have this space for a bit longer to enable different networking at the end of this. So I really invite everyone to stay, talk to our panelists, and get to know each other. Again, I really appreciate everyone's participation and participation from our international guests. And thank you so much to this panel for a great and stimulating discussion. This is an important conversation to bring to COP, and I was grateful for your help in bringing it. So thank you very much.